Hello and welcome to this short video, Food Fraud. My name's Andy Bowles and I'm a food lawyer. Now this is the 29th in a series of 100 short videos that I'm recording on UK food law topics. You may be watching this video as part of our online training service, in which case you'll have access to 4 one-hour webinars on this topic, as well as being able to download various materials, including the presentation that's showing up behind me. But if you're watching this on YouTube, you're very welcome to join me. Okay, so what is food fraud? Well, there isn't an internationally recognised definition of food fraud. I mean, they all sort of follow the same sort of common theme, but I thought I'd choose a definition, might as well choose one, that was used by Professor Elliott. Professor Elliott was part of an investigation into the horse meat scandal that occurred in the UK and across some of Europe, back in 2012. And he came up with this working definition of food fraud, which I think is perfectly adequate. It's deliberate and intentional substitution, addition, tampering, or misrepresentation of food, food ingredients or food packaging, or false or misleading statements made about a product for economic gain. Now, food fraud can occur at any level, but it's when it becomes food crime that I guess we're more concerned about it. Because food crime is when it's no longer just the acts of a few rogue food business operators, but is actually organised activity perpetrated by organised criminal groups. So food crime is significant and serious. Food fraud is, of course, the topic that I'm talking about today. Now, one element of food fraud that's important, I suppose, is the fraud. And I should just make the point now that a key part of fraud is dishonesty. In food law, there are many complexities. I'm recording 100 videos on the topic, and if you've watched some of them, you'll realise that actually some of these topics are a bit tricky. It's very possible that food business operators will make mistakes. They might decide to try and cut corners for economic gain, but they have no intention of actually defrauding anybody. They didn't realise that what their actions might lead to somebody being misled about their product, for example. So the law is actually very clear in England and Wales. For somebody to be convicted of fraud, then it would need to be demonstrated that they were actively dishonest. In other words, what they were doing was they knew was wrong. They knew, and the average person put in the same circumstances would also realise that what they were doing was wrong and would lead to one of these fraudulent behaviours. So, simple mistakes is not fraud. Simple mistakes that actually result in economic gain are not fraud. Fraud is when someone sets out to and actually achieves deception, if you like. Okay, so different types of food crime. Remember, we're talking about organised fraud, if you like, in these occasions. These were published by the Food Standards Agency a year or so ago, and I think are a useful guide through this presentation. Forms of crime. The first one is adulteration. This involves adding a substance to a food to increase its weight or volume, or improve its appearance or taste. For example, chili powder might be spiked with cheaper, potentially harmful additives, or honey might be mixed with cheaper corn syrup. We then have document fraud, basically using false documents or genuine documents that tend to deceive or pass specific controls. If you've watched my videos on import controls, then you'll know, for example, documentation forms a key element of that. If you've watched my video on organic food, you'll also realise that documentation forms a really important part of the integrity of organic foods. So someone who deliberately goes out of their way to falsify documents or use genuine documents in order to mislead would be committing this sort of crime. Illegal processing involves illegally slaughtering or preparing meat or related products in unapproved establishments or using unauthorised techniques. You need to watch my videos on approved establishments to get that. But basically, if you're producing or slaughtering animals in the United Kingdom or involved in cutting them at primal cut level, then you need to be approved by typically the Food Standards Agency. There are some exceptions to that. So somebody operating in a legal slaughterhouse would be operating this type of fraud. Misrepresentation. This involves misleading consumers about the nature, substance, source or quality of a food product. For example, a product might be labelled as organic when it is not, or a food may be marketed as being from a specific region or made with certain ingredients when it is not. There are videos on UK geographical indications, for example. I've got videos on the substance, nature, substance and quality. Next one is substitution. This involves replacing a more expensive or higher quality food with a cheaper or lower quality substitute. For example, olive oil might be diluted with cheaper vegetable oil, or fish may be mislabeled as a more expensive species. Then we have theft. This involves dishonestly obtaining food, drink or feed products to profit from the use or sale. And lastly, we have waste diversion. It involves illegally diverting food or drink or feed meant for disposal back into the supply chain. So those are the main forms of food fraud, and they're food crimes because when they're on that organised level. So why does food fraud happen? Well, there are a number of factors here. Clearly, there has to be circumstance, but there'll be economic gain. So the more expensive a food is, not just per kilogram, if you like, but per quantity. You know, you've got foods out there, commodities out there that are traded in large amounts. Therefore, a fraud can reap big economic benefits. But that's one of the factors. It's got to be worth doing. If you're going to get involved in organised crime, there has to be, at the end of it all, a purpose. So economic is key. The last one there, criminality. There has to be the circumstances where people are willing to become criminals, undertake and perform criminal acts. Remember, fraud is a purposeful act. Somebody committing a fraud knows they're doing it, and they've decided that it's worth doing, presumably for economic reasons. Then we have the two in the middle. These are big factors because there's not a lot you can do about the fact that there are criminals out there. There's not a lot a food business can do about the fact that some foods are more expensive than others. But the next two are really where food businesses should focus their activities, because criminals will seek out vulnerabilities in supply chains, and they will also seek out opportunities. So there is a lot of research on this, that where you have vulnerable supply chains, where you present criminals with the opportunity to commit fraud, then there is more likelihood that that will occur. So preventative measures often focus on identifying those sorts of issues. A key document in the United Kingdom is the PAS 96 document, the Guide to Protecting and Defending Food and Drink from Deliberate Attack. PAS 96 covers a whole range of issues. It's not just dealing with food fraud, because obviously there are other reasons why people might want to attack the food supply chain. There could be animal rights activists, for example, or other politically driven or motivated activists might want to interfere with the food supply chain. So PAS 96 deals with a whole range of different threats, but with the two issues at its core, the vulnerability and opportunity issues. What PAS 96 does, it suggests some approaches that can be used by food businesses to try and prevent food fraud. One of those being a threat assessment critical control point system, TACCP. Another one is a vulnerability assessment, which is VASSP. But the key about TACCP and VASSP is that they are risk assessments performed by businesses looking at their supply chains to identify vulnerabilities and threats, to look out for circumstances where people who are willing to step into the area of criminality are actually provided with the opportunity to do so. So if you're a food business and you're concerned about food fraud, then the minimum you could do is undertake a threat assessment of your supply chain. As a general principle, this will involve, firstly, understanding your supply chain, because many food businesses don't. In my experience, a lot of food businesses will buy ingredients, for example, from brokers. They buy from the commodities markets. They might have rather vague supply chains. Now, their initial supply chains may be quite clear. They know who they're buying from, and if you've watched my videos on traceability, they may meet the legal requirements in that respect, the one step forward, one step back approach. So if you're a food business and you know where you get your ingredients from, then that's great. But if you don't know where your supplier has got their ingredients from, then that becomes a concern. And the longer a supply chain, the more vulnerable it is. So step one, I guess, in any assessment of a threat associated with food fraud in the food business is understanding the food chain, the supply chain. The second step is to take active steps to reduce down the supply chain. So the more compact a supply chain is, the more fixed it is. So you don't have too much flexibility in supply chain, then the less vulnerable you are to attack, if you like, use that term, from fraudsters. Of course, fraudsters don't have to be external agents, they can be internal, they can be within your company. So you also have to look at the whole process. Now, the Food Standards Agency has done a lot of recent work on this. One of the things that they've looked at is whether, first of all, actually detection of food fraud is the best way forward. Detection being identifying fraud once it's happened, or whether businesses should be doing more on prevention. And that's really the key finding from some of their studies. They've looked at a couple of published works. What Works to Prevent Food Fraud is a very key document where the Food Standards Agency are suggesting that more effort should be placed on by businesses of taking preventative actions and looking at the cost of food crime. It costs billions. That's just the truth to the UK food economy, not just because of the loss of income from food businesses, but from the effort to try and prevent, detect and to bring fraudsters to account. It's a huge amount of money. The Food Standards Agency have brought out a food crime confidential hotline through their National Food Crime Unit. So the hotline number in the UK is 0800 028 1180. So anyone who suspects food fraud should use that to get in touch with the authorities. The Food Standards Agency have published some guidance for food businesses on their website, how to spot the signs of food fraud, providing a mechanism to report incidents of food fraud to the Food Standards Agency, to the National Food Crime Unit, and also additional useful resources for them. Reporting mechanisms are absolutely key. And if you're watching my video on our online training service, I provided links to all of these. Okay, so there we are. That's food fraud in a nutshell. That's just one of 100 short videos that I'm recording. I hope you'll join me on the 99 others. Thank you for watching.